Hello there, my name is Rosie Goldsmith and welcome to Rock Talks, our conversation series featuring literary rock stars from both Romania and Britain. These live hour-long conversations are part of our month-long literature festival, Romania Rocks, brought to you by the Romanian Cultural Institute in London, the RCI, and the European Literature Network, ELNet. This is the final week of our festival and our final Rock Talk. For this special occasion, you have two hosts, no less. I'm joined by my festival co-curator and our creative producer, GABRIELA MOCAN, who's in Cluj in Romania. Hi, Gabriela.
Hello, Rosie.
Nice to finally be doing this together, I think, too. And we're bringing our two countries together and then going a bit further afield tonight as well to the United States. Now, Gabriela and I believe, represent the mission of this festival to unite literature-loving Romanians with their like-minded British counterparts. We've worked together for several months with festival director Magda Stror and our tireless team to create the first ever Romanian-British festival, to bring these two cultures together, to forge new friendships and future partnerships, we hope. Without the funding and support of the Romanian Cultural Institute in London, this would not have happened. So thank you to them. And Romania, we have shown already, really does rock. The idea behind these Rock Talks series is to bring together some of Romania's and Britain's greatest living writers. So do catch up with our whole series on our YouTube channel. Now, all our events are free. They've all been filmed, so you can enjoy them forever and ever, basically. Now, by writers, we of course include translators. And tonight, Gabriela and I would like to introduce you to two of our greatest English language translators of some of Romania's greatest writers, Philip Boehm and Sean Cotter. So over to Gabriela to introduce the two of them. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you, Rosie, and welcome to our guests. Before introducing our special guest for tonight, I would like to briefly recap a bit on our roller coaster festival so far, which, as Rosie has already said, for those of you watching our event tonight, has not only included these amazing rock talks that brought together authors from both countries, but also events dedicated to translators. We had another event including 7 translators that made Romanian literature well known abroad. Also events dedicated to the publishing sector, since publishing literature in translation nowadays has become quite a challenge, and especially when it comes to countries whose languages are not spoken that widely, like Romania. But we also had a wide variety of events, including film screenings, children's activities, different sorts of workshops, and we really hope that we have managed to get to every taste and every age. This started from a great idea that our colleague Magda Stror had from the Romanian Cultural Institute. And I worked together with Rosie and Magda and our whole team intensively to put together this festival, which we hope has been exciting so far. But without further ado, let me go back to our special guest for tonight. We are very excited to welcome Philip Boehm and Sean Cotter, whose numerous awards and accomplishments to date cannot be reduced to a simple reference list. When we first thought of bringing Philip and Sean together, we knew that we're in for a double treat. The joy of what promises to be a delightful conversation with 2 star translators whose work actually encompasses various skills and preoccupations, but also the exciting prospect of hearing them speak about 2 of the authors they represent across borders, also known as 2 of Romania's most notable writers, Herta Müller and Mircea Cărtărescu. Counting more than 30 translations of prose works and plays from German and Polish into English, Philip Boehm is also an accomplished playwright and theatre director. Sean Cotter is a translator of Romanian literature, a scholar specializing in translation and modernism, and a professor of literature and translation studies at the University of Texas. It's lovely to have you both with us. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and welcome to our Rock Talk. Rosie, over to you for the first questions.
Well, we'll sort of go with the flow and see how these two translators and writers and professors and directors and so on perform. And Philip obviously knows about theatre and performance. So basically, just before we start, now you both got beards. That doesn't necessarily mean you are related. It doesn't necessarily mean you know each other. Do you know each other? Have you met before? Philip?
Briefly, we've met before, briefly.
Sean, and do you have any connection at all? I mean, you both won awards. I imagine you sort of met at awards ceremonies, I should think.
You might know the American Literary Translators Association, which is a nationwide organization dedicated to, obviously, promotion of literary translation and also for creating networks of translators. And Philip got, he's going to be too modest to say, but he got the highest prize from that for, I think it was for The Hunger Angel, a translation from Herta Müller. And I was lucky enough to be one of the people shaking his hand that evening.
Well, look,
which you could do back then without fear.
back
goodness,
in the days we
yes.
shake hands.
And we could attend awards ceremonies and prizes and festivals too. But well, at least we've got you here tonight. So tell me something. One of the first things we really like to do with Rock Talks is to find out a little bit about you and you know, whether you one day when you were 5 years old, you said, I want to be a translator when I grow up. How did you start off? I mean, tell us about your early years and, you know, whether you grew up learning languages, you know, what brought you to where you are today? Let's start with Sean.
Oh, I grew up hating languages. My parents were both German professors. They had met in grad school, and my father was teaching at Ohio State, and they thought that they'd be kind of going back every couple of years and that they would raise their son with a firm grasp of a beautiful language. And I was a really good kid in every other way except this one, where my mother had kind of a neighborhood German school going on in the living room, and I would behave so poorly I would get kicked out. I'll go up to my room upstairs and stomp on the floor trying to annoy them. The earliest contact I had with Romania was also kind of, I think it was in the 5th grade. So I was around 10, and I was supposed to do a report on a country. And so in which report means you go to the encyclopedia and copy down as much as you can by hand. So I went over, so I wanted to do Tibet for whatever reason. And I went to the encyclopedia and I opened it up, and I found out that Tibet was no longer a country. And so I had to put the encyclopedia back, and then just going over from T to S seemed a little kind of uncreative. So I went from T to R and opened it up, and I wrote a report on Romania. I could still remember the picture of Sala Palatului and of course Ceausescu that were in the article. But that was it for the longest time. And then I found myself in Romania 20 years later.
Did you find yourself?
Oh, I was in Bucharest. So I went over, actually it wasn't quite 20 years later, it's 1994, and I was a Peace Corps volunteer. And I was supposed to go to Kazakhstan, but there was a problem with one of the stamps on my paperwork. And they said, oh, we've invited you to Kazakhstan, but please disregard that. We don't know where we're going to send you, but we're going to send you someplace. There
seems to be a theme that you're aiming further east, but you keep winding up in Romania.
Yeah, it's a magnetic attraction. Maybe it's a solenoid that's attracted me in there.
That's right.
Philip, what about you? What about your early life and languages?
Well, I didn't grow up. I mean, I grew up hearing a lot of Spanish because grew up in Texas. But I basically learned German in school, and then I lived in Poland for many years. I was in the theater academy in Warsaw, and at one point, I was in New York visiting a friend, and he said that they were looking for someone to translate Ingeborg Bachmann. And at the time I was earning in non-transferable zlotys, and it was not very much, even on the black market. And I submitted a sample, and lo and behold, they accepted it. And that was a book called Malina by Bachmann. And since then, I have been unable to escape the translation world. And so I've just been translating different things, mostly from German, because most of the time the publishers, there are more German books. To what Gabriela was saying, it's a bigger language, there are more books, there are more connections, but some from Polish and occasionally from other languages. But the other languages mostly plays.
Gabriela, have you got any questions? Or I could ask you forever about languages, and so I mean, German's my second language, so I'm very, very happy you started with Ingeborg Bachmann, because I studied her at university. So.
I was going to ask Philip, actually, since Sean already shared his connection with Romania, how he came to Romania. I was going to ask Philip if he visited Romania. And
I've been in Romania. I've been a long time ago. It was still Ceausescu, and I was in your hometown, which I find, and I remember thinking, one day I'll come back and stay for longer, because I traveled all over the place. Actually, I was in Craiova, I was in Suceava, not so long in Bucharest, and I have friends who are from Bucharest, and of course Herta from Banat. So I've been, but my aim is to go back, but not just for a week, and staying in various odd hostels, and sometimes I think it wasn't in. There was one time where I almost spent the night in a field. It was a good thing I didn't, because then upon closer inspection the next morning, it was a military training ground, and so I think that would have been a bad thing. But no, I'm also interested in the whole multicultural aspect of Romania, which obviously is something we can talk about, and it extends so far beyond the language. It extends to all these different cultures, these crossroads and the shifting borders and everything. I translated a book by Gregor von Retzori, and when he grew, he was born in the Austrian Empire. He grew up, it was Kingdom of Romania, and then it was a brief time, it was Gross Deutschland, and then it was, and now it's in, in Ukraine, what I would call Chernovitz, but I think that there's so many influences. I mean, how many languages were being spoken just in the past 100 years within the territory that is now Romania, and it's so culturally diverse. And I think people don't realize that. And I think that's reflected in a lot of the literature.
I think, it's interesting for me hearing you say that about the languages. I always think that people don't understand how extraordinarily beautiful and diverse Romania as a country is.
Right.
It's just I'm just traveling around just short areas. It is so, every area is so different. Every city is so different. It's really, I mean, Sean, you obviously love it as well. You keep going back. And when you're actually translating, is it the language that attracts you first and foremost, or is it also the country and the cultures and the surrounding paraphernalia, if you like, of all the languages? Do you get immersed in them as well, Sean? Do you really sort of go,
yeah, I was just
traditions, give me a Romanian blouse any day,
Yeah, I don't wear the blouse as often as I used to. But I think it's absolutely true that there's a tremendous and vibrant diversity in the languages of Romania and the cultures of Romania, and this is one of the things that makes it interesting. I mean, you're at the crossroads of three dead empires: the Ottoman, the Russian, and the Austro-Hungarian. And just and Philip was talking about Gregor von Retzori, who really does capture that. And was it an Ermine in Chernopol? Was that the book? That was yours, yeah. I've taught that book for my classes.
Oh, wow, that's great.
Yeah, it was very popular. Yeah, I actually, one of the students started calling me the commissar from that book, because he. Anyway, that's a different story. Yeah, so I'm just finishing up a translation of a novel from 1929 in which the difference in languages is front and center in the style, which is called Cry de Corte Vecche, which I'm translating as Rakes of the Old Court. It's a novel that in 2001, 100 Romanian critics voted as the best novel ever written in Romanian. But it's not quite in Romanian because one of the things that Mate does in his prose is he exploits the etymological resources to an amazing extent, to an extent that it's really a shame to translate it because you're taking away this interplay between all of the different language traditions in Romania that he brings out with all sorts of cranky and dramatic consequences for the book itself. So look for that in your bookstores next year.
That's great.
Actually, I was going to ask you, Sean, the author that you mentioned is Mateu Caragiale, and I was going to ask a question related to this because you mostly translate contemporary literature and contemporary authors. What made you choose to translate, to embark on this really challenging project that many translators probably would have avoided?
Right. Many translators have avoided it. This is actually, now that I say that, there have been some people that tried it in English before. My scholarly background is in modernism. And so I've spent a lot of time reading European writers and Anglophone writers from this time period. And I was kind of looking for a text that would allow me to work in that area in Romania. I wrote my dissertation in part on Lucian Blaga, who is a modernist writer from who wrote most of his things before World War II. And also just when someone tells you this is the best novel ever written in Romanian, and it turns out that it's not even that long, then and I have a little bit of kind of inbred audacity to that makes me want to try something like that. And so it's really been an extraordinary experience and a lot of fun to translate.
Have you worked with Max Blecher at all? I know Michael Henry Heim translated the one work, but
yeah, that was his last book before Heim passed away, and his only book in Romanian. Yeah, no, I've taught him and I've read him, but I haven't translated him myself.
Philip,
Helga Miller wrote a little piece for that book when the New Directions.
Yeah. That's right.
It's great that you're finding these connections actually too. Really great. I'm just wondering, Philip, do you have that, what this idea of immersing yourself in the cultures of the countries, of the languages you speak and translate from? Did you do that with Poland and with Germany as well?
I tend to do that when I'm directing a play because I have to do it when I'm directing a play. You have to recreate a world, and in order to recreate a world or to create a world on stage, you have to immerse yourself somehow in the world that is the play. And so there's a parallel in translating a book. Now, it doesn't necessarily, just as we talked about the, is there a Romanian culture? I don't think so. There's so many different cultures. And of course, Herta Miller's Romania is a very different Romania than most people's. And it's Adam Zagajewski was born in Lviv, but he never lived there. But for him, the city of Lviv or Lviv looms so large, and there are so many different places. Each novel has its own world. But in order to enter those worlds, yes, I do have to immerse myself into that culture, but also in that time period. So that what I frequently do is, if I were, for instance, translating books from the time that Sean was talking about, going in and looking at some of the artwork. I translated recently this book by Arthur Kessler, where there's all this Marxist philosophical back and forth, but there's also an aesthetic at the time, and trying to understand what those people, what are the tastes, the smells, translating Herta Miller, pays a great deal of attention to botany because of where she grew up, and then the differences she noticed when she moved from this tiny village in the countryside to the big city, and what plants meant what, and why certain plants she associated with the party and oppression, and other plants reminded her of just the very simple daily beauty. And so, but I have to immerse myself into all of those details in order to feel connected with the book. And sometimes it gets a little distracting. And so I take a little longer than a lot of people, I think, because I get so easily distracted. I mean, you know, now I translated a book by Rafik Shami, who writes in German, but he's from Damascus. And it was horrible because there was so much description of food. And I was so hungry translating this book, and there was only one Middle Eastern restaurant where I was living, and it just wasn't the same thing. So, but the sights and the smells, so I need to immerse myself into that to some extent. And as far as the language goes, the language, it can't be separated from all of that. So that's a long-winded yes.
Can I ask you a question, Philip, about the language in Herta Because I wonder how much Romanian material, you mentioned Romanian plants, but I know that in the books I've read from her, she's constantly making reference to Romanian social structures, and there's Romanian folk songs that are showing up translated into German, but they're originally Romanian folk songs. So you've got all this translation that's happening in the German text itself. Like, does that come through for you?
Funny you should ask that. I found something from an interview I did with her for the Paris Review. And she talks about, let me read a little bit. She talks about Romania, because I was asking her about growing up, and of course she grew up not only with, it was a German dialect. So she talks about all the differences in the local languages. And anyway, I asked about Romanian, and she said, so when we had a little bit in school, I'm quoting now, after all, it was the official state language, but we never had more than 1 or 2 hours a week, and the teachers were German and they spoke it relatively poorly. So when I moved to the city, I hardly spoke any Romanian, and I was very insecure. For 1.5 years, all I did was listen, but I liked the sound of the language. I liked all the idioms. I liked how melodic it was, and I liked all the poetic images that come up in everyday speech. In fact, it's that everyday Romanian that's the most interesting. It's very sensual and is able to hint at vulgarity without being crude. That doesn't exist in German, where the language can turn so ugly and crude very quickly. But in Romanian, it's different. Cursing is an art, kind of magic. True curses are always magical because they're always in the moment. They vary according to the mood of the speaker, and they're made to fit the situation at hand. I think that's great. And she goes on in this interview. I asked her, and when you write this Romanian point of view, write alongside the German? And she said, always. After all, I grew up in Romania. I can't tell whether a given image in my head comes from one language or the other, or which one I'm using when an object or a situation comes to mind. It's probably sometimes one way and sometimes the other, or else it's all mixed together. But naturally, the Romanian is writing right alongside the German. I don't write in Romanian because I'd be too insecure for that, but it grew inside my head, and I don't know where each thought comes from.
Did Herta Müller ever write in Romanian?
One book.
One small thing.
Ioan este nu este Ioan. It's a book made from cut out words. Just gonna, the whole, she must have had a whole box full of little snips out of ads and newspapers and that type of thing, and then they're arranged on the page.
She's been doing that, and her floor is littered with these little, looks like she's writing ransom notes.
Yeah, exactly.
Philip, what do you think about Herta Müller's Romanian language? Because you translate from German. You are not translating from Romanian, but how can you delve into the Romanian and to go to that part of Herta's brain that thinks and writes in Romanian?
Well, what I do is, even though I don't speak Romanian, alas, and I should say yet, I still hold hope that I might learn this. I do, when I encounter things that I suspect have a Romanian root, I start looking for it, and I can tell enough because I have some Romance languages, and I figure it out. And I have a couple Romanian friends, and so I've been consulting with them, and when I sense something, so and then I read a lot. What she's referring to often are idioms, and these idioms sometimes, strangely, the Romanian version of an idiom might be a little like the Polish, not linguistically alike, but the image might be like. And I know there's the same kind of immediacy, and also there's a relationship with the kind of physical world. I think there's a closer relationship between the language and let's say that the agricultural world, the seasonal world. They're more tangible and less abstract than a lot of German. And so I think that, and there's there are differences, between these there's a lot of different Austrian writers, and it's very hard to generalize, but their experience is often very different than other German language writers, right? Or the Swiss writers are different. So Hertha, I'm trying to understand. So I read a whole lot about the background, and then when I encounter these Romanian phrases, and it was the same with Gregor von Rezor. There's Romanian, and so I would go and there might be a song in his book, and I go and I have to learn that song. So obviously, if I should have gone to the Romanian Cultural Institute in London for all of this, and instead of looking it up online.
It's interesting how you both, refer to, say, music and theatre and the connections, obviously, with translation and with language. And I just wonder whether you could both talk a little bit about that, because what you do in the rest of your life, if you like, your additional professions, to what extent they overlap or feed into each other. Philip, I'm thinking primarily of your theatre work, and you're a playwright as well. And Sean, of course, working in the historical periods, the modernism and so on that you've been working on. I wonder how all that feeds into the translation process.
I was giving a speech in Yash about a year ago, again, when one could travel and do these things. And I asked whether anyone could be a translator without being a modernist. Because I think that so many of our ideas about translation were kind of incubated in the modernist period. And sometimes it's just kind of like that people translating from Chinese imitate Ezra Pound, the person that Eliot said was the inventor of Chinese poetry for our time, and he did create this mode of translating Chinese poetry. But also it's the fact that translation for the modernists, modernism is this aesthetic that comes about from cultures coming together with there's a greater sense of connection, and the world is shrinking and people are moving more quickly between places and linked up by the telegraph and the telephone and all these things. This sense of the compression of the world is also an encounter with the foreign. And for modernists, translation becomes an intimate part of the creative work. And so for me, that helps me think about translation in a broader way. Not only that one translation is creative, but I can think about these as kind of projects more than texts that I'm translating. And so that I end up writing around the texts and writing out, autobiographical things that help me understand this text as part of a broader experience. So when I was translating Liliana Ursu, for example, she's someone that moves back and forth. She had 2 Fulbrights in the United States, and her poetry treats these themes of moving back and forth. One of the things that happened was that she was sending me poems in translation when she was in Pennsylvania, not Transylvania, but Pennsylvania. And so then I would translate them in Michigan, where I was in grad school at the time, and I'd send them back to her in Pennsylvania. And these were poems in Romanian about Romanian things, but also about being between Transylvania and Pennsylvania. But what happened was when she moved back and Bucharest, she lost the original poems. And so when it came time to publish the book, we had older versions of the poems, which are usually longer, match my translations. But since I was able to think about translation as a project and as a kind of a representation of biography and his whole experience, I managed somehow to convince the publisher to publish these mismatching versions, because we felt like that those mismatched versions were actually truer to her experience of moving between cultures than perfectly matched versions would be. So this meant convincing a publisher to publish blank pages, a book that was longer and more expensive for him than it needed to be. But fortunately, Jim Cates was the publisher of Zephyr, and he's a translator himself, and was not difficult to convince. But I think I wouldn't have gotten to that with the project. I realize it's kind of a series of tangents there, but I wouldn't have gotten to that place with Liliana, who is a wonderful person to work with, and a very powerful poet. I wouldn't have gotten there without studying the modernists first.
Philip, what about you? And
Well,
your overlapping careers?
Yeah, I think that I mentioned before about immersing in the world, but there's another overlap, a very big overlap, and that's in directing a play. I'm moving. There's the play script is just that. It's like a musical score. It doesn't really mean anything unless it's presented on stage, and then it comes to life. But when it comes to life, you have to make all these decisions, and in order to make those decisions, you're helping the actors make decisions, ideally, but you have to hear these voices first. You have to hear all these characters' voices, and you have to hear them in a way that sounds right, and also that will be transmitted.
I remember also Philip was talking once about translation playing the same text with a different instrument, a different musical instrument. And that really does ring true in some way, I should imagine, Sean, this idea of, you know, the original author and the second author, the first musician and the second musician taking over. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's, have you got your own mottos and metaphors to translate?
Music is a classic example. I just can't get over the fact that Philip was saying we have to hear, and that's when we stopped hearing him. But back in a second. Yeah, so when I explain what I do to people, one of the things that surprises, and I'm talking, you know, folks that I happen to, you know, talk to while I'm at a cocktail or something, one of the things that surprises them is how many of my problems are really not Romanian problems. That understanding Romanian is you know, important. Immersing yourself, as we've been talking about, this is very important. But my real problems, hey, there's Philip again. Philip, I was just saying that I don't know if you would agree with this or not, but that a lot of my problems are not original language problems, but my problems are when I hear something or understand something in the original language, it's the recalcitrance of English. That's a problem. And so I was leading up on one of the things you were saying and thinking that, yeah, it's kind of like hearing a symphony and being overwhelmed by it and discussing it with friends and staying up late at night drinking wine and yelling at each other about how beautiful the symphony is and whatever happened in it. And then the next morning, when everyone's passed out on your floor and you wake up first, and you're hungover and you kind of stumble past your piano and you try to pick out a few notes on the piano that would recreate the symphony you heard from before. Obviously, that's the difficult point there is, first of all, your hangover, and second, the recalcitrance of the piano to do what a symphony could do. And of course, what happens is that you kind of pound away for a little while, you wake everybody else up, and they all start complaining that you're making noise. This is really what translation is like for me.
Yeah, and especially if you're not a pianist, then it's. I've often said that the only reason I'm in translation or theater, for that matter, is because I'd rather be a cellist, but I don't know how to play the cello, so it's kind of a hard thing to become a cellist unless you know how to play it. But yeah, no, and I think that's very true. The recalcitrance of English, or perhaps the like cooking, you know, making a recipe in Poland where they have sugar from beets, you can't translate it to Texas cane sugar. I mean, there's a different taste, you know, that you're never going to get that. The flour is going to be different. You're not going to have if I make this Romanian, mamurica that's different from Southern grits, right? And different grind of the corn, different corn to begin with. But I was saying with the theater, there's also these tiny details. And one time I was translating a book by Christoph Hein, and there was a scene where this couple was attacked in their summer home, and I could not figure out the architecture of the scene but then I happened to visit him, and he said, "Oh, that really happened to me right here." And then he had this very strange dacha. I mean, and suddenly I could understand. So, but being able to envision also in a play, if I'm directing the actor and it's a play taking place in Europe, and I say open the window, and the actor goes like this, well, that's an American window, but a window in most of Europe opens like that. So it's these little gestures, how and then how far do we want to go with it? How much local color to preserve? Do I keep the Romanian in Gregor von Rezzori? And the answer is yes. But how much of that? And then we have these biases, like it's okay to include French words in an English text, but oh, heaven forfend that you put Romanian or Polish or Macedonian. It's like why? So there are all those things to bear in mind.
I think this probably feels like a good time to have some readings, isn't it? I just also wondering, it's interesting how translators have taken on a much greater public role, a more visible role at theatre, festivals and events and so on. Too, you become like the embodiment, the representative of your author in some ways, which thankfully you're going to be doing for us in a few minutes with your readings. But do you mind that? Do you mind being more public? Do you like it?
Yes, I mean, this is an important cause for translators. That I mentioned ALTA before, which has lobbied for people to be, for scholars to be recognized for translations to be recognized as scholarship for promotion and tenure, for example. So I was promoted to tenure at my school on the basis of 3 translations. And it's, and this, I was looking for a place, and this is a good one, to really celebrate the festival, these Romania Rocks Festival, for showing us, 3 events with centered on translators is one thing, but you've really also shown how translation and movement between languages is a central part of contemporary Romanian literature. And this is transformative, right? That from the old version of a kind of a Cold War version of Romania that would be locked in and gray and uninteresting, you've really shown it to be a dynamic place, and that translators is kind of emblems of the movement between cultures that's already happening. So it's been terrific to watch all of these.
And the vibrancy, it's also reviving the vibrancy in our minds that I think probably people of my parents' generation, they had a different, I remember there was this woman growing up who was from Romania, and her descriptions of it, but she had left, I think, I don't know, just after the war. I can't remember exactly, but her description, there was still this, her descriptions were so vibrant and so like exciting. And then this Cold War thing that you described, the bleak gray, image that was promulgated took place. So this really is an important series of events, and we should celebrate y'all. So
I think it would be quite interesting, since we are at this stage now, to hear maybe a fragment from Herta Müller's work.
Okay, yeah. Speaking of cold and bleak times,
exactly.
This book, which was originally intended to be co-written with Oscar Pastor, who himself had been sent to a labor camp, most ethnic Germans after the war, between ages of late teens and up to 40 something, 50 in case of men, were sent as a kind of war reparations by Stalin to labor in these camps in what is now Ukraine mostly, And this, the conditions were horrible. A lot of people died, and hunger was a constant accompaniment. The title of this book in German is Atemschaukel, which means like breath swing, but talk about recalcitrance of language. That I had to go through various other ideas, and finally there's a figure in the book, this hunger angel, that makes repeated appearances. But I'm not going to read about the hunger angel. I'm going to read a different passage, which is a little more self-contained. Sean, forgive me if you've heard this one before at Alta. And it gives a sense of life in the camp. And interesting is the detail. It's called the Zeppelin. Behind the factory is a place with no coke ovens, no extractor fans, no steaming pipes, where the tracks come to an end, where all we can see from the mouth of the coal silo is a heap of rubble, overgrown with flowering weeds, a pitiful bare patch of earth at the edge of the wilderness, crisscrossed by well-trodden paths. There, out of sight to all but the white cloud drifting from the cooling tower far across the steppe, is a gigantic rusted pipe, a discarded seamless steel tube from before the war. The pipe is 7 or 8 meters long and 2 meters high, and has been welded together at the end closest to the silo. The end that faces the empty fields is open. A mighty pipe. No one knows how it wound up here, but everyone knows what purpose it has served since we arrived in the camp. It's called the Zeppelin. This Zeppelin may not float high and silver in the sky, but it does set your mind adrift. It's a by-the-hour hotel tolerated by the camp administration and the nachalniks, a trysting place where the women from our camp meet with German POWs who are clearing the rubble in the wasteland or in the bombed-out factories. Wildcat weddings was how Anton Kovac put it. Open your eyes sometimes when you're shoveling coal, he told me. As late as the summer of Stalingrad, that last summer on the veranda at home, a love-thirsty female voice had spoken from the radio, her accent straight from the Reich. Every German woman should give the Führer a child. My Aunt Fidi asked my mother, how are we to do that? Is the Führer planning to come here to Transylvania every night, or are we supposed to line up one by one and visit him in the Reich? We were eating jugged hare. My mother licked the sauce off a bay leaf, pulling the leaf slowly out of her mouth. And when she had licked it clean, she stuck it in her buttonhole. I had a feeling they were only pretending to make fun of him. The twinkle in their eyes suggested they'd be more than a little happy to oblige. My father noticed as well. He wrinkled his forehead and forgot to chew for a while. And my grandmother said, I thought you didn't like men with mustaches. Send the Führer a telegram that he better shave first. Since the silo yard was vacant after work and the sun still glaring high above the grass, I went down the path to the Zeppelin and looked inside. The front of the pipe was shadowy. The middle was very dim and the back was pitch dark. The next day I opened my eyes while I was shoveling coal. Late in the afternoon, I saw 3 or 4 men coming through the weeds. They wore quilted work jackets like ours, except theirs had stripes. Just outside the Zeppelin, they sat down in the grass up to their necks. Soon a torn pillowcase appeared on a stick outside the pipe, a sign for occupied. A while later, the little flag was gone. Then it quickly reappeared and disappeared once more. As soon as the first men had gone, the next 3 or 4 came and sat down in the grass. I also saw how the women in the work brigades covered for each other. While 3 or 4 wandered off into the weeds, the others engaged the nachalnik in conversation. When he asked about the ones who had left, they explained it was because of stomach cramps and diarrhea. That was true too, at least for some, but of course he couldn't tell for how many. The nachalnik chewed on his lip and listened for a while, but then kept turning his head more and more frequently in the direction of the Zeppelin. At that point, I saw the women resort to a new tactic. They whispered to our singer, Loni Mich, who began singing loud enough to shatter glass, drowning out all the noise made by our shoveling. Evening spreads across the vale, softly sings the nightingale, and suddenly all the women who had disappeared were back. They crowded in among us and shoveled away as if nothing had happened. I liked the name Zeppelin. It resonated with the silvery forgetting of our misery and with the quick cat-like coupling. I realized that these unknown German men had everything our men were lacking. They had been sent by the Führer into the world as warriors, and they were also the right age, neither childishly young nor overripe like our men. Of course, they too were miserable and degraded, but they had seen battle, had fought in the war. For our women, they were heroes, a notch above the forced laborers, offering more than evening love in a barrack bed behind a blanket. Evening love in the barrack remained indispensable, but for our women, it smelled of their own hardship, the same coal and the same longing for home. And it led to the same work. It led to the same work out, give and take. The men provided the food. The women cleaned and consoled. Love in the Zeppelin was free of all concerns except for the hoisting and lowering of the little white flag. Anton Kovac was convinced I would disapprove of the women going to the Zeppelin. No one could have guessed that I understood them all too well, that I knew all about arousal in disheveled clothes, about roving desire and gasping delight in the Alder Park and the Neptune baths. No one could imagine that I was reliving my own rendezvous more and more often. Swallow, fur, ear, thread, aureole, cap, hare, cat, seagull, then pearl. No one had any idea I was carrying so many cover names in my head and so much silence around my neck. Even inside the Zeppelin, love had its seasons. The wildcat weddings came to an end in our second year, first because of the winter, and later because of the hunger. When the hunger angel was running rampant during the skin and bones time, when male and female could not be distinguished from each other, coal was still unloaded at the silo, but the paths and the weeds were overgrown. Purple tufted vetch clambered among the white yarrow and the red orach. The blue burdocks bloomed, and the thistles as well. The Zeppelin slept and belonged to the rust, just as the coal belonged to the camp, the grass belonged to the steppe, and we belonged to hunger.
Thank you as well. I was trying to think where you were while you were translating this this book, since you were telling us earlier about you being totally immersed. I was trying to picture the setting and the ritual, if there was any ritual in translating her as Hunger Angel.
It was actually a difficult time for various reasons, personally, but a lot of this was translated in a kind of furious pace, which I don't like, but it was a very intense translation. And I was, I've translated a lot of, for some reason, I seem to be a specialist in these horrible times. I've translated a lot of books that have to do with the war, the Holocaust, the immediate aftermath of the war, the camps. And so I knew a lot of these details from this other work, like the quilted jackets. I don't know what, I think in Romanian that you say pufoică or something like that. So I know them from Polish and Russian, and it's just, they're all different versions of the same thing, but we call them kufajka, and it's like, so that familiarity, I was able to put myself in there, and I was working mostly in a very kind of in isolation, just to get there. But I had a lot of it was just very intense, is what I remember. It was hard to get out of that book.
Yeah, no wonder.
Also, coal. There's a lot of talk of coal in the book. And I mean, I was doing all this research in all this type of coal. And, you know, again, I happen to be very interested in botany myself. So the plant names are, that's okay. But, you know, why these coal markings would be, because Oscar Pastio remembered something, he told it to Herta Miller, and then I checked, and I would check it back. So I was reading like Russian sources on coal that was being used for these, you know, just to get the thing right. But there's so much machinery there, hard. So,
Sean, do you have a question for Philip related to his what he just said and to the fragment? If not, maybe we can move on to you, focus on you and particularly on your work related to blinding, Mircea Cărtărescu's Blinding, which is the first volume by Mircea Cărtărescu that you translated.
No, I mean, that was such a beautiful reading, and
Yeah.
and I'm still kind of in the light of it there, in the mood of it. It's really a beautiful translation as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, the Cărtărescu is part of it is set around World War II in Bucharest, but that's not the part that I was going to read. And there's really, I can't think of anything more different from the place we just were than the text that I was thinking of reading.
Could you tell us before actually reading, could you tell us how you got to Mircea Cărtărescu and how did you decide to translate him in the first place?
Oh, I mean, Mircea Cărtărescu, ever since I began working on Romanian literature, has been the kind of the dominant figure. I was, you know, I was hoping at some point to translate it, and then I was asked to prepare a sample in a very kind of non-eventful way, and that sample didn't go to one press, but they passed it along to different press. They passed it to Archipelago, and Archipelago wanted to do it, and I was overjoyed. I did try to meet Mircea when I was first starting out. This is a possibly embarrassing story, but what I did when I was first starting out was I prepared a series of slips of paper that said, "My name is Sean Cotter. I want to translate stuff. Would you let me?" In more elegant terms than that. And I got, with some help of some friends, I got a bunch of addresses and started walking around Bucharest and stuffing these in people's mailboxes. I told you, it's kind of embarrassing. It's right on the level of, do you like me? Check yes, if yes, check no, no. Anna Blondiana, who was one of your earlier talks, responded really generously, called me on the phone to the amazement of the family I was staying with, and invited me to her office. And I still have the books that she gave me that day. But I got one of these slips to Mircea because he was teaching at the university at the time, and he agreed to meet me. But the meeting didn't really work. We agreed we were going to meet at a place called FS Pub, which was in the middle of Bucharest at the time. Right now, I think that same location is a McDonald's. But it's a good place to meet for a beer. And somehow we were unable to find each other. We were both there at the same time. And I know that I remember this very well because when I came in as a young translator, like full of ambition and like, I'm going to go meet Mircea Cărtărescu and I'm going to seem smart. As I was coming in, the tile floor of the FS Pub was about an inch higher than the ground right outside the door. And so as I came kind of striding in, my toe clipped the tile and I went sailing into the air. And one of these kind of Wile E. Coyote moments where I was perpendicular to the floor for probably 8 to 10 seconds, just hanging in the air like that before I smacked down. So I made a dramatic entrance and still we couldn't find each other. Like I thought if that wasn't enough to get somebody's attention, I still have, when I got back to the United States, I got a letter from Mircea saying, "I'm sorry we couldn't meet. I was at the FS Pub at this time." A really generous letter, very gracious. And I still have it. It's over there next to my copy of Blinding, along with some of my notes from translating the novel. So I mean, eventually we met through very ordinary ways when Archipelago invited him to come over.
And since then, whenever it comes to a new translation, you are quite connected. Like I'm sure that he wouldn't feel very comfortable to have somebody else translate his work. You're actually working on translating Solenoid now.
Yes, and there are other translators. Adam Sorkin just came out with a volume of his Petrescu's earlier poetry. Julian Similian translated Nostalgia for New Directions. So there's more than one of us. But yeah, he's a very approachable and very generous person. Whenever I have questions about the translation, I send him an email. There was a point during translating Blinding when two of the characters, his mother and another character, go to a fair, and they done Landsur. Say done Landsur. I was like, they do what to the chains? They do something to the chains? And I had no idea what was going on. So eventually I just had to write him and said, your translator's an idiot. I have no idea what you're talking about. And he said, oh, this is a carnival ride. And so we started trading pictures of carnival rides. And I'd send him a picture of kind of the teacups types of rides. He says, is it this? And he said, no, it's a spinning thing, but it's much more dangerous than that. And eventually it turned out to be one of these where the top spins and there are these chairs hanging on chains. And you sit in the chair and then they kind of go out like this and it spins around. So anyway, so things like that, or have always been, he's been very generous with his availability on all these types of questions.
It would be wonderful to hear a fragment from you as well, Sean.
Sure, yeah. I'll read a little bit. As I said, this is a very different situation. So a lot of the conceits in Blinding are this kind of faux or semi-faux autobiography. And so one of the questions is, where did the narrator's family come from? And the narrator is called Mircea. And his grandfather's or great-grandfather's family is said to have come from a small town in Bulgaria. And so I'm going to read part of the account of how the reason why they left their small town. The family is called the Badislavs. And what happened was, before the part that I'm reading, the village was some travelers introduced the village to opium, and this resulted in the entire village kind of falling apart, falling into these long opium waste periods when they were either drugged out or everyone was having sex with everybody else. And one of the things that they forgot to do was to feed the dead, to kind of ritually remember the dead and to lay out food for them. So the dead decide to rebel, and all of the skeletons of the dead of this village come together underground and form an army and assault the villagers. The villagers hide within a church, and the dead try to assault the church, but they don't. The skeletons aren't able to do this, so they draw a circle on the ground and call up a series of creatures from the depths of hell. So that's what I'm going to read for you. These are this is the part when the demons arrived. They were demons. They sprang from the enchanted circle like the fabled coming of evil, filling the sky with wings and howls, filling the earth with squirts of venom and sperm, and filling the divine being with terror. Cricket demons swarmed onto the church's roof. They slid their saw tails through the tiles and dropped long eggs inside, which burst into poisonous spiders with 100 legs each. But the priest in his gold-threaded robes turned them to stone, dousing them with holy water. Demons tunneled through the earth and sprang up among the kneeling people. But the incense from the censer poured into their large nostrils and exploded their serpent heads into 1,000 splinters. Bat demons grabbed up rocks, swooped over the earth, and let them go. As soon as the angelic vibration of prayer reached them, however, the stones stopped in the air and opened like enormous buds, spreading fleshy petals, strangely beautiful, until the sky over the church was filled with multicolored flowers. Insane with rage, demons scuttled onto the walls. They scurried over the roof, scratching and scraping with their claws until no part of the holy place could be seen under the wormy swarm, the demented tangle, the furious ravel of wings and antennae. Then the heavy doors swung open, and the 40 villagers in white long shirts, their faces and hands translucent red in the light of the candles they carried, came out holding on to each other tightly, led by the priest with a beard to his waist, frowning and determined like an icon of God the Father. His powerful hands emerged from long sleeves to grip a cross as long as a league, which, like the cross on each person's chest, sparkled like gold. Stronger still, scintillating like a diamond with millions of fires, the tooth of the martyr glowed in its glass box, tied now to a girl's forehead. The light shone over the valley. It turned the surrounding cliffs as transparent as gemstones, and with an ever greater power, it rose in a single column of greatness toward the sky, shattering the clouds, moving the stars aside, revealing the endlessly gentle majesty of the Trinity. And through the field of light, flurries of angels began to fall, ablaze with bows and quivers, long spears in their hands, their golden wire locks fluttering in descent. A cry of victory broke out from the Bodislav chests. Touching the ground with their feet, the transparent heralds built of ideas and crystal partook of the power of the earth. Thin threads of blood grew in their feet, spreading quickly through their bodies of light, becoming systems of veins and arteries, visible inside like those in the translucent bodies of shrimp. A porphyry blood colored their lips and cheeks, and enormous wings, like swan's wings, attached themselves to the naves of their chests with triangular, powerful muscles. The courageous elate, in their gold-plated armor, formed a phalanx and drove their spears forward into the brazen band of the dead. A few moments later, the terrible subterranean host had turned into a pile of tibiae, vertebrae, mandibles, skulls, and pelvises, yellowed like old wax, their venom still steaming toward the sky. The demons ran down the sides of the church like thick swamp water, leaving it stained with saliva and excrement, and like a pack of rabid wolves, they threw themselves onto the phalanx of angels, for they knew them, each in part. These were the faithful, the ones who had stayed with the Lord during the Great Rebellion, the ones made million in glory, while the others descended into the subdivine, subhuman, sub-animal, and wrapped in the spiral of blood of the eternally damned. Deep in the being of each demon, behind the scales, claws, and dragon wings, lived an angel in tears. The battle intensified, quaking the little valley as flakes of silver snowed. Protected by icons and crosses wrapped in veils of incense, the villagers watched the melee with wide eyes, arm in arm, their beards on end and their flesh quivering. The angels skewered the cacodemons with arrows of steel, glass, and light. They hacked them with double-edged swords, spilling black blood in the snow. They flew up and strangled the winged demons with their wide hands. Dragons and werewolves, locusts with human heads, and humans with fly heads, opened their snouts, muzzles, and beaks and vomited jets of fire at the celestial legion. Some angels, their wings in multicolored flames like fireworks, like birds of paradise, fell down onto a shack or into a leafless path. Like fat dogs with bared teeth, 3 or 4 devils would pounce on the heavenly heralds, nauseating them with the breath of their bowels, spraying them with urine from the impressive hoses between their legs, and covering them with murderous curses, more venomous than the fire they blew from their mouths. For the devastating speech of blasphemy filled the heavenly minds with terrible pain. Wave after wave of monsters attacked the spiky rectangular phalanx, wearing it away, plucking soldiers out and throwing them into the dark. At every assault, devils also fell, writhing into the snow. But then, when the snowfall slowed toward dawn, the angels began to sing. They threw down their dripping swords and their lances with snuffed flames. They took off their transparent armor and stood in long white robes, rings of golden hair falling from their shoulders to their waists. Cheek by cheek, their blue voices trained on the sky, the angels sang. They lifted their girlish voices toward God, gentle and fresh as saplings or the stalks of carnations. They offered the crystal filigree of the Psalms into the cold, hard air. The people cried like children, clutching their icons against their chests. The hill of bones began to rumble, and the skeletons assembled themselves again. The skulls found their bodies, the femurs joined to hips, and as though grown from the yeast of the unearthly song, new and tender flesh touched the cold bones again. Muscle was wrapped in skin, and soon, naked and young again, all of them 30 years old, the dead rose to their feet. Waving one last time to the living kin, the group of unclothed men and women turned slowly toward the cemetery. One of them paused in front of the church to trace a wide circle of fire over the ground. The demons, petrified once the angelic psalms began, now scurried into the well of transparent earth. They dove inside, grabbing onto windpipes of light, trailing meters of intestines from their slit stomachs, and leaving behind mountains of vomit and blood before becoming smaller and smaller and smaller and disappearing into the dark.
We've only got a few minutes left, unfortunately, but that is almost the best possible ending, I think, just to be able to sit and listen to you both. It's such beautiful readings, and that goes back to this idea, you know, obviously you're very good at representing your authors in public and at events and so on too, because, you know, you are their voice as well. I mean, Sean, you've just translated an 800-page novel from Mircea Cătărescu.
Almost translated.
Almost finished. So what's keeping you? Can't wait. But it's a very, very long piece of work. And I know that other friends, colleagues from Spain and France who've already had a translation, they say it is the world's greatest surrealist novel, or at least of the 21st century. Is that your feeling about it? Do you still love it even after all this time of translating?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's not easy to. I mean, as you heard, he has a certain intensity in his work, and that
you could say that again.
Like Philip, I translated Blinding under a kind of a time crunch, and it was fairly overwhelming. There was if we have time just for a very short anecdote. My wife decided that I really needed to stop because I was starting to act a little nutty, and so we all went up to Chicago where my parents were living at the time, and Blinding is filled with, you know, with butterflies and gemstones and all this kind of all the things you just heard of, all the amazing glittering details. And it's like, you got to get out of that. So we went up there and we were walking around with our girls, and they wanted to go into the store that sold little kind of rocks. It was a rock shop, it was called, in downtown Evanston. And I walked inside, and the whole place was filled with buckets of shining stones, and there were actually literal dried butterflies in frames and all these things. And I literally just had to stop and walk out backwards and run away. And I eventually got my wife to buy Mircea a little. Actually, I picked it out. I eventually got myself together, and I picked out this little slice of, I forget the name of it, but it's a sliced nautilus shell from like 100,000 years ago, right? So it's these petrified, multicolor rock formations now. And so I sent that to Mircea, and he says he's got that next to his computer. So the most new thing he has and the oldest thing he has are right next to each other on the same desk.
That's great.
You know, that's great too that you mentioned rocks, because very few people comment on the fact that with this is also in the title of our festival. It is also named after these wonderful, very special rocks in Romania called the Trovant. But I suppose, you know, just to conclude for both of you, what does it bring you personally and professionally to work with these great writers and with this language as well? I mean, you are so immersed in it. We can tell just from when you're reading them as well, how immersed you are in their work, and you obviously know them now well. Do you know Mircea Cătărescu well, Sean?
Oh, we have a good professional relationship, I would describe it. Yeah.
So what does it do to your life, if you like, and your psyche to be so close to these authors? Mircea first. Has it enriched you in some way?
Well, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I don't even know where to begin. I mean, my original plan coming out of college was I was going to go pursue a PhD in something like English literature, and then I didn't for a variety of reasons, and I ended up living in Romania for 2 years, and it was during that time that also kind of a curiosity about translation came up for me, and I just think about how dull I would have been if I'd gone straight through and I hadn't, you know, how boring I would be to myself in the first place. You know, this has added so much to my life many interesting people that I've met, and to know such a vibrant place, and to be able to express myself in different ways when I'm there. And I mean, I was supposed to go there over the summer and to bring my girls for the first time, and that's been, you know, other people have had harder pandemics, but that's been one of the worst parts about it for me, is that I wasn't able to share that with my two daughters. Just what an amazing world has opened up as a result of me knowing Romania. And of course, you know, having access to the people in Romania that are the most interesting to me, which is to say its writers, its poets, its prose writers, and its thinkers, and all these people who have such a higher status in Romania than they do in the United States. It's just an absolute joy. And it's made my life, transformed my life completely, and made it something that I'm happy to live.
Oh, wonderful. And I'm sure that that's what everybody would like, that Romanian writing becomes much better known in the US, but also in the UK. And, you know, Philip, you and Sean are both doing exactly that. How do you feel about of course, you've not just translated Herta Müller. We know that, oh, my goodness, you know, you've translated so many of the German greats as well. But what does it do for you personally to live with these writers in their work and to know them as well as you do?
Some of them I know quite well. Herta I know quite well. And one of the benefits is I wouldn't be here, I wouldn't have met you all if it hadn't been for that relationship. So that's already a great thing. And when each writer is, of course, different. Each writer has a different world. Each writer summons a different world. And sometimes the writers don't really want to talk about those things. And sometimes we just, you know, Herta, for instance, I might have questions, and sometimes she'll answer, sometimes it doesn't really matter. Because at one point it's like, well, you know what I mean. And because I know her that well. But then there are writers, unfortunately, who are no longer with us. So I can't really ask Franz Kafka what, you know, but I can still, you know, try and immerse myself in that world. But it is, as Sean was saying, and I know this, in a lot of European countries, writers, artists, musicians are given, do have a higher status, if you will, than they do in the States, and especially under certain regimes. And the fact that we're able to meet these people, and not just them, it's again, and I'm not just saying this, it's also meeting you, because all the work you're doing, you're connecting cultures just as we're connecting cultures, and you're in this you're at this cultural crossroads as well. And, you know, it's all about building bridges, but also I have insights from this event today that I wouldn't have had we not had this Zoom event. And so I thank you for that.
I'm going to thank Gabriela too at this moment too, who's been one of our greatest bridge builders, and maybe Gabriela can see us out in the nicest way. But thank you from me personally very, very much.
Well, I think the nicest way is just to say a big, huge thank you from all our hearts to both of you for being with us tonight. It's been really special, and we hope that this is just the first edition of Romania Rocks, and that we'll see you for future editions and future events. So thank you so much, Philip, Sean, and thank you to everyone who watched us tonight. Do tune in tomorrow. We have a surprise for you, a reading marathon, in which you will have the chance to meet 20 plus of Romania's most exciting authors. So stay tuned.